Conversations with Niki is brought to you by studyapps.co.za, South Africa's leading education app for tablets. Welcome to Conversations with Niki. I am Niki Seberini. So pleased, so delighted to be with you, and so delighted that you tuned in for the show. I'd like to welcome our syndication partner listeners. That's Radio Today in Johannesburg. It's Timoning Stereo 89.1, Eldo's FM, High FM, Kawi FM, West Coast FM, MC 90.3 FM in Plettenberg Bay, Neisner FM, Wild Coast FM, and Bay FM. And thank you so much for all the emails that I've been receiving. Recommendations for shows. You know, that's what I say. Conversations with Niki. We're having conversations with all sorts of people. And really the objective is to give you an opportunity to listen to sometimes just ordinary people who have done fantastic things, and sometimes people who have done so many studies on a particular topic and share their expertise with you and with me. And I find it a growing experience, and I really hope that you do too. So a reminder that the podcasts are put onto the website, which is www.conversationswithniki.co.za, and that's one word, and Niki spelled N-I-K-I. You can also like my Facebook page, because I put the podcasts of the show there, and that is Conversations with Niki, or you can follow me on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is @Seberini, S-E-B-E-R-I-N-I. So we are today talking about relationships. And you know, relationships can be so difficult. One moment they can fill us with ecstasy, with joy. You walk through the streets and the colors seem so much brighter. You have this marvelous feeling of butterflies in your stomach. You almost don't have an appetite because life is wonderful. And the very next moment, all of a sudden, it's very dark and it's so difficult to see the wood from the trees. And it's not only in romantic relationships, it can be in relationships with friends and with family members as well. So we thought if we were going to be talking about relationships, let's bring in the true genius when it comes. And why do I say that? Because everybody talks about a book when people are having problems in relationships. And here it is, we're talking about marriage, intimate relationships. Everyone talks about The 5 Love Languages, written by Gary Chapman. And it all boils down to speaking to the person that you love in the language that they can relate to. I mean, does that sound difficult? Does that sound confusing? Does that sound simple? Well, I think it's difficult, confusing, and simple, because it's one thing having an idea of languages, but how does one adapt? How does one listen? How does one change so that this can happen? So all of a sudden you are communicating one-on-one in a far more intimate manner with your partner. So Gary Chapman has joined us. We are so delighted to be chatting to him all the way in North Carolina, 9 o'clock in the morning, I believe it is. As I said, he is the author of this best-selling book, 5 Love Languages. It's a series. He's also director of marriage and family life consultants, and he travels the world presenting seminars, and his radio program airs on more than 100 stations. So Gary, a very warm welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Niki. It's good to be with you today.
So Gary, you have been married for 45 years. That's no small feat. Tell me, when you first married Carolyn, was it a bed of roses, or was this kind of your learning curve in the build-up to writing the book?
Well, for us, it was a learning curve.
Oh, yes. I think everyone's nodding.
As you were talking, I was thinking, oh, yes, that's exactly right, Niki, what you're saying about the in-love experience. You know, before we got married, I had never been so happy. I mean, this girl, there was just something about her. I could hardly wait to be with her. I loved being with her, and when I was apart, I wanted to be with her. I mean, it was absolutely incredible, and I'd never experienced love at that level before. And I thought that it's going to last forever. I mean, if you've got the real thing, it's going to last forever. Nobody told me that I would come down off that high. And I know now, of course, we've studied this phenomena that we normally call falling in love or being in love, that the average lifespan of that euphoria is 2 years. I didn't know that. And my wife and I had been dating for almost 2 years before we got married. So I came down off the high, Nikki, pretty soon after the honeymoon. And, and I began to discover things about her I didn't like, and she discovered things about me she didn't like. And so what did? We told each other, and asked each other to change. And we ended up getting into arguments and said things that were hurtful and painful and raised our voices at each other. And, really, within 6 months of our marriage, I was wondering, why did we get married? We don't agree on anything. And I was plagued with the thought, I have married the wrong person, and it's going to be this way forever. So, yeah, I identify with people when they're married and struggling and feeling like, wow, we lost whatever it was we had before we got married.
You mentioned something interesting. You and your wife talking to one another or shouting, whatever it was, wanting one another to change. And that word change, I'm sure you've heard this, Gary, when they say a man goes into a relationship hoping that this woman that he's fallen in love with will stay the same. A woman goes into a marriage hoping that she'll be able to eventually change him. And I don't know if there's any truth in that whatsoever. But this word change, is it fair to ask another human being to change? It's hard enough to change oneself.
Yeah. Well, I think it's all right, Nikki, to ask people to change, but when we demand that they change, then we're in trouble. Because ultimately, you can't make someone change. I think you can create a climate where they're more likely to listen to your requests, but we should make requests of each other, not demands of each other. No question about it. There's certain things that irritate you about your spouse. Everybody. It's just true because we're humans, and humans don't think the same way. We don't respond the same way. So, yes, there are things that irritate us in the relationship. But if we are loving them and affirming them and supporting them, they're far more likely to respond when we make a request of them. Honey, would it be possible for you to do whatever you're desiring? And because they feel loved and supported by you, they may well respond to that. So I think it's okay to make requests, but we dare not build a relationship on demands. You do this or else.
I suppose that's when you really get to the angry stage. But we spoke about this falling in love, and you said in your book, desire for romantic love in marriage is deeply rooted in our psychological makeup. And we see it in movies, and we see it, we read about it in books and in adverts or whatever it is. It's this ideal relationship where there's beautiful music in the background and everyone's smiling with these sparkly white teeth. So do you think, perhaps, Gary, that we just have a completely wrong idea of what marriage is about? And I know you're talking about loving and affirming and respecting, but do we perhaps need to lower our expectations?
Well, I think that is part of the problem, that we tend to think that this euphoric feeling, which is making us super happy, is going to last forever, and that the real goal of marriage is to be happy, to make each other happy. And when you're in love, you really are doing everything you can to make each other happy because you're pushed along by these euphoric emotions that you have. But when you lose those emotions, you lose the emotional high, we go back to being normal. And normal is, I'm selfish. I want what I want. I want you to make me happy. And if you don't make me happy, then I'm not going to make you happy. And because of our self-centeredness, and there's a good part of that, Nikki, because when we're self-centered, it does mean that we feed ourselves, we get exercise, we get rest. There's a good part of that. But when that self-centeredness becomes selfishness, so we view the relationship in terms of what am I getting out of this, then the relationship's going downhill. Because love, genuine love, has to do with looking out for the interest of the other person. The attitude is, how can I enrich your life? How can I make your life easier? How can I be a good husband or a good wife to you? That's the attitude of love, and then it finds appropriate ways to express it.
I love that. I absolutely love that. did it take you a long time to realize that when you first got married and you had this disappointment and you thought, oh my goodness, 6 months into the marriage, why did you do it? When you did start to work on the different languages, was that something that was important for you, realizing, getting to a point when you thought, I really love this woman and I want to make her happy and therefore I want to make it work?
You know, I wish, Nikki, that I had been able to read the 5 love languages when I was early in my marriage. I wish it had been written and I could have read it. I think it would have helped me greatly. But we struggled. I had no concept of the love languages, and I just knew she wasn't responding the way I thought she should. She wasn't treating me the way I thought she should treat me. And really, I was pretty much in despair. I mean, I know what it is to be married and feel like it's never going to be any better. And I guess that's why I have so much empathy with people who sit in my office and say, you know, we just don't have any hope. We feel like we've tried everything. It's just not getting any better. Because I've been there. But it was not a quick fix for us. It was slowly, over a period of time, that we began to learn you know, how to reach out to each other, how to affirm each other, how to communicate to each other that we really cared. I didn't have a clear picture in those days of the 5 love languages, but bit by bit, over a period of several years, actually, we began to learn how to be team members instead of enemies, you know, shooting at each other all the time.
Yeah.
And that's really what you hope a marriage is going to be. We're going to be teammates. We're on the same team, and we're trying to help each other reach our potential for good in the world. And when that happens, then marriage is wonderful.
So is that why you wrote the book? Because you had discovered this and you just so wanted to share it with everyone?
Yes. What happened, Nikki, I had been counseling. I went into counseling. When I got to be an adult, I went into counseling. And I had been counseling people probably for 15 years. And I was having people in my office say exactly what I had felt in those years. You know, one of them would say, I just feel like he doesn't love me anymore. And sometimes the other one would say, well, I don't understand that. You know, I do this and this and this and this for you. Why wouldn't you feel loved? And I knew there was a pattern to what I was hearing over and over again. I didn't know what it was. So what I did, I sat down and read 12 years of notes that I made when I was counseling people and asked myself the question, when someone said in my office, I feel like my spouse doesn't love me, what did they want? What were they complaining about? And their answers fell into 5 categories. And I later called them the 5 love languages. And so I started sharing the concept in the counseling office, you know, that we have different languages and we need to learn to speak our love in the language of the other person. And couples would come back sometimes just in 3 weeks and say, wow, this has changed the whole climate of our marriage. And then I started sharing it in small groups, and the same thing would happen. And probably 5 years later, when I'd been using this concept in my counseling and in small groups, I thought, you know, if I could write a book and write it in the language of the common person, leave out all the psychological jargon and just talk plain English,
too true.
Maybe I could help a lot of people that I would never have time to see in my office. That's what motivated me to write the book. And, of course, little did I know that the book would eventually be translated in 50 languages around the world and sell 9 million copies in English. So it's just been amazing to see how that book has helped so many couples learn how to stay connected emotionally.
Gee, that's incredibly rewarding. Must be for you, very rewarding. Gary, so what you're saying is that everyone has, well, maybe you, I mean, I think this is what you're saying, is that everyone has their own love language. Does that mean it's the way they express their love, or the way they want their love expressed by another?
I'm thinking primarily the way they want to receive love.
Okay.
But for about 75% of the people, the way they express love most often to others is the way they want to receive love. For example, if a person is always just normally, kind of naturally affirming people verbally, you know, encouraging people verbally, speaking words of affirmation, very likely that's what they would like for people to be speaking to them, words of affirmation. So about 75% of the people, what you speak most often is what you want. Now, I say 25% of the people, they speak one language predominantly, but they prefer to receive another language. And I think the reason for that is they learned how to speak that language growing up. Their parents taught them how to speak that language. And so they speak it, but they speak it to others, but it's not really what they want.
I see.
They're speaking it because they were taught to do that by their parents.
So when you work with a couple, the first thing I'm sure you have to do is get them to identify what their love language is.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and I think there are several ways to do that. You know, in the back of the book we have a little profile where they answer questions, and it helps them discover their love language. But here are 3 clues on what the love language of your spouse is. How do they express love to other people? Observe their behavior. And if you see your spouse, when they greet people, they always give them a hug or they pat them on the back. They're touching people, physical touch. And so physical touch is probably their language because that's what they're speaking. So ask yourself, how does my spouse typically express love to other people? Then the second clue, what do they complain about most often? And that is a huge clue. If your spouse says to you, I don't think you would ever touch me if I didn't initiate it, they're telling you that physical touch is their language. Or if they say to you when you've been on a business trip and come home, you didn't bring me anything, they're telling you gifts is their language. So what do they complain about? And then thirdly, what do they request most often? If they say to you, honey, could you give me a back rub? They're asking you for physical touch. If they say, could we take a walk after dinner? They're asking you for quality time. So if you put those 3 together, observe their behavior, what do they complain about, and what do they request most often, you can pretty easily figure out the primary love language of the other person.
Okay. So let's look at these 5 languages, love languages. So you've got words of affirmation, quality time, receiving gifts, acts of service, and physical touch. Let's start off with words of affirmation. Doesn't everyone want words of affirmation? I suppose what I'm saying is, do we all just have this one? I know you talk about a primary love language. Do we have a primary, or do we want a little bit of everything?
Well, I think, Nikki, we can receive love in all 5 languages. But one of them typically is going to stand out more deeply. It's going to communicate more deeply to us. It's very similar to spoken language. Everyone grows up speaking a language with a dialect. You know, I grew up speaking English, in American style, Southern American style, okay? You grew up speaking English, South African, dialect. So we all grow up with a language and a dialect, and that's the one we understand best. The same thing is true with love. One of these will speak more deeply to us than the others. So if words of affirmation is your primary love language, we could call it your native tongue. If this is your primary love language, this is what will communicate love to you more deeply. And if your spouse or close friend or anyone else doesn't give you affirming words, then you will not feel loved even though they're speaking some of the other love languages. So the key is you have to learn to speak the other person's language. And words of affirmation is one of the fundamental languages of love.
What are words of affirmation? I love you. You look great. There was a delicious meal. Gee, I enjoy it when you come home with a bunch of flowers, or you really handled that situation well. I'm so proud of you. Is that what you mean by words of affirmation?
Exactly, Nikki. And they can focus on the way the person looks. You know, your hair looks nice today. You look nice in that outfit. You can focus on how they look. You can focus on something they have done for you. Really appreciate the time you put into this meal. I just love it. Something they've done for you. Or you can give them encouraging words. maybe you know that your spouse would like to do a particular project. Maybe they want to lose weight. Maybe they want to write an article. Maybe, that whatever. And you say to them, if they've expressed the desire to do that, you say, well, honey, if you choose to do that, I know you'll be a success, because one of the things I appreciate about you is you put yourself to something, you're going to see it through. And I know you can do it, and I'll stand with you. Well, that's an encouraging word, and they will try something that maybe they would not have tried if they hadn't had that encouraging word from you. So it's words that build up the other person. It's words that encourage the other person. And for some people, words speaks most deeply to them. There's an ancient Hebrew proverb that says life and death is in the power of the tongue. You can kill people or you can give them life by the way you talk to them. And we're talking about giving them affirming words.
So what about the situation where you have a couple and the one's love language is words of affirmation and the other one is, for example, physical touch, let's say. And the one whose love language is physical touch simply finds it very difficult to express themselves. So maybe it's difficult. Maybe they grew up, so they don't know what words of encouragement are. And they have no idea that they can use words to compliment another person. What happens in that situation, Gary?
Well, it's very common that we will grow up not knowing how to speak some of these languages because we didn't get them as a child.
Right.
And if you didn't receive affirming words as a child, then it won't be very natural to you to give affirming words when you're an adult. But the good news is you can learn to speak all of these languages. And with words of affirmation, what I say is start where you are. And if you find it extremely difficult to express words of affirmation, then get you a notebook and begin to write down sentences that you hear other people say that are affirming. Maybe something you read in a magazine article, something you saw on TV. Write these statements down, stand in front of a mirror and read them out loud so you hear yourself saying these words, and then pick out one that you think is fitting for your spouse and memorize it, and then walk in the room where they are. Maybe they're looking in the other direction, and you just say it, and then you can run. You broke the silence. You said it. And the second time it will be easier, and the third time it will be easier. You can learn to speak words of affirmation. And so, we have to be honest about where we are. It doesn't come natural. You mentioned physical touch, for example. There's some people that are just not touchers. And they will say to you and say to me in my office, well, I'm just not a touchy-feely person. I mean, I don't get into this hugging and putting your hand on somebody's shoulder and patting them. I'm not a touchy person. And I usually say, well, do you have two hands? And if so, can you put them together? Now imagine putting your hands around your spouse and bringing them together. Or if you can't get them all the way around your spouse, you just put them partly around the spouse. And if you hug them 100 times, it'll begin to feel more comfortable for you. It's like learning a spoken language. It takes time, it takes effort, but the more you speak it, the easier it becomes.
And I suppose once you're doing it and your partner is responding in a positive way, there's your affirmation to continue with whatever it is, whatever love language you're trying to learn for your partner. So just seeing a response would be a great encouragement to continue with that.
Well, you're exactly right, because we all, I think at least in the early years of the marriage, we want our spouses to feel loved. And when we're speaking the right language, they do respond differently to us. I mean, we all are drawn to the person who loves us. Love stimulates love. And when I'm feeling loved by my wife, then my behavior's different. My words are different toward her. And yes, that is an encouragement to her. Now, sometimes in a very, very broken marriage, Niki, people will read my book, and they will try to figure out their spouse's language, and then they will try it for 3 weeks. They'll try speaking it. And then they say to me, well, I've tried this for 3 weeks, and it doesn't seem to be making any difference. And what I typically say is this: why don't you try it for 3 months, not 3 weeks, but 3 months?
Okay.
And it's going to take some time to turn a broken marriage around. And I suggest also that they preface, if you're in a really, really difficult marriage and you'd like for it to be better, first of all, look at your own life and ask yourself, where have I been failing my spouse? What am I doing and saying that I should not? And then go apologize for those things. Just say to your spouse, I've been thinking about us, and I know that I have said a lot of critical things to you, and I've just been thinking that I want to apologize to you because of this and this and this and this, and just apologize to them. And maybe they forgive you, maybe they don't, but at least in their mind, they're thinking, wow, that's different. And then, after you've apologized, you start speaking their primary language. And again, they're thinking, wow, what's happening to them? And something is happening to you. You see, you've been willing to acknowledge your own failures, and now you're reaching out to speak their language. And it's just a matter of time that most spouses will begin to respond to you in a positive way, and even begin to ask you questions such as, what could I do to help you? Or how could I be a better husband or a better wife? And now you're on the road to really healing that marriage.
The word that really popped out for me was willingness, the willingness to go and do that. But there's another word that stands out there as well, as you were talking about, and it's ego. I'm sure that ego can trip this process up quite a bit.
Well, that's true, because by nature, if we're in a troubled marriage, most of us think that the problem is the other person.
Of course.
And we will say, well, I know I'm not perfect, but the real problem here is, and we call our spouse's name. It's really their problem. And often, if a wife, for example, asks a husband to go for counseling, he will say, well, I don't have any problems. It's your problem. You go for counseling. In his mind, it's her problem. In her mind, it's his problem. In the reality is, Niki, none of us are perfect.
Yeah.
All of us say and do things that are painful and hurtful to our spouses from time to time. But if we deal with those things, if we will go apologize for those things, we keep the wall torn down between us. What is so sad is that couples will go for years offending each other, hurting each other. Every one of those is like a block in a wall between us. And we build these high walls, these thick walls, and it's just like we're living in the same house. We're two roommates. Every once in a while we hurt each other. Most of the time we just stay away from each other. And that's not marriage. Marriage has to do with an intimate relationship. But we have to deal with our failures, apologize, ask for forgiveness, and then choose to forgive if we're going to keep the walls torn down so we can love each other effectively, we can process life together, and marriage can be what we really wanted when we got married. A unity between the husband and wife in which you really feel supported and encouraged by each other.
As you talk about that love tank, keeping the love tank full. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that picture.
Me too.
Gasoline tank in a car. If it's full, you can drive the car. If the gasoline tank is empty, it's not going anywhere. So I picture inside each of us, there is an emotional love tank. And if the love tank is full, that is, if you genuinely feel loved by your spouse, or if a child, for example, genuinely feels loved by the parents, that child will grow up normally. But if the love tank is empty in that child and they do not feel loved by the parents, that child will grow up with many internal struggles. And in the teenage years, that child will go looking for love, typically in all the wrong places. And the same thing is true with adults. If you have an empty love tank in your marriage and you feel like your spouse really doesn't love you, they wish they had not married you, life can begin to look pretty dark. And much of the misbehavior in marriage, just as the misbehavior of children, grows out of an empty love tank. We're not feeling loved, and so we end up doing things that are hurtful and painful to each other.
Gary, we're going to take a break. We'll be back in a moment, and then let's continue with the love languages, and let's look at quality time. Please stay with us.
Support the Sunflower Fund National Bandana Day on 12 October by buying your bandana for only 25 Rand from Pick n Pay or your local round table. Your help could save the lives of patients suffering with life-threatening blood disorders like leukemia. Swipe your smart shopper card when you buy your bandana from Pick n Pay and you could win one of 5 iPads or one of 5 10,000 Rand shopping vouchers. T's and C's apply. For more information, call 0800 12 10 82. Get your bandana today and share a little happiness.
Want to send a message to your favorite Radio Today presenter? Or send a general comment or request to Radio Today? Well, you can by simply SMSing your message to 44008. That's 44008. Standard SMS rates apply. Radio Today. Radio that delivers.
Well, this is Conversations with Niki. Welcome to it. I'm Niki Seberini, and it's great to be in your company. I'd like to welcome our syndication partner listeners. It's Radio Today Johannesburg. It's Timaning Stereo 89.1, Eldo's FM, High FM, Kawi FM, West Coast FM, MC 90.3 FM in Plettenberg Bay, Knysna FM, Wild Coast FM, and Bay FM. And we're having such an interesting conversation, a conversation about relationships. And, you know, we live in a world where we watch movies and we see these rom-coms and we think, oh, we almost fall in love with the characters because we're falling in love with the type of love that they have. And it's almost as if that's the love we yearn for. So sometimes there's this very unrealistic expectation about love and romance and marriage. But the good news really is that when things do go wrong, they can also go very right. And I think it's just through being willing to open yourself to this process, being willing to love your partner enough to put in the effort to listen very, very closely to them so that you can move forward in this relationship and find this wonderful intimacy in this very, very strong connection. So I have a man who has helped millions of people around the world with his best-selling book, The 5 Love Languages. And Gary Chapman, who I have on the line, has gone around the world. He has helped so many people really through the books, but also through consultancy, through seminars, his radio program, which airs on more than 100 stations. And he's just getting people to communicate. And it's about communicating in the correct love language. So what we've covered is when we look at a love language, and Gary talks about it being a primary love language or almost like your native tongue, the way you want to be loved, and then identifying the way your partner wants to be loved. And it's finding what the love language is and being able to communicate using that love language. I hope I've explained it correctly, Gary, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, but that's certainly my understanding of where we are. We were looking at the first love language.
That was a good summary, Niki. Yes.
Great, Gary. We were looking at the first love language, which is words of affirmation and to build your partner up and to use words of encouragement. And I just thought that was fantastic. But let's look at love language number 2, which is quality time. Just that word time, really. We live in a world where there's not enough of it, is there?
Yes. You know, for some people, this is very difficult, Niki, just because the fact we are busy. But for some people, quality time is their primary language. And if you don't give them quality time, and by quality time, I mean undivided attention, if you don't give them some undivided attention, then they're not going to feel loved. And I'm not talking about simply being in the same room. I'm not talking about sitting there watching television together because someone else has your attention, you know, on the TV screen. I'm talking about sitting there, TV is off, you're looking at each other, you're talking to each other, you're processing life together, letting each other in on what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what your dreams are, what your frustrations are. You're sharing life together, giving them your undivided attention. If the telephone rings, you don't answer it, because you're involved in an important matter. You're caring for your spouse. You're giving them quality time. And for some people, this is what makes them feel loved, when you give them your undivided attention.
When you first wrote this book, the technology that exists today did not exist then. When we walk around with these smartphones, We are literally contactable anywhere in the world at any time. And so that has changed as well. Have you noticed, going around with doing your seminars, that this has impacted a lot on relationships, especially in terms of quality time?
It has, Niki, and I will be sitting in a restaurant looking over at a couple eating together, and one of their phone rings, and one of them gets on the phone for 10 minutes talking to someone else while they're sitting there eating with their spouse. And I'm thinking, I hope you're a medical doctor and this is a medical emergency. Otherwise, you are going to be in trouble, because, especially if your spouse's language is quality time. You're sitting there with them, but you are not with them. You are somewhere else on your phone. So I just think, yes, I think technology can be help, because when we're apart from each other, for example, we can contact each other on phone. We can send text messages to each other. We can send emails to each other. And yes, all of that is positive. But when we are physically together, if you're going to give quality time, you need to be all there. And if you're taking a walk down the road and your telephone rings, you need to let it go to voicemail. We're talking, we're together, you're the important person in my life. That's what we're trying to convey.
Is it kind of like having a date night? If you are both very, very busy, you've got hectic lives, maybe you've got kids or you haven't, or it's a career, whatever it is, and there always seems to be something important. I mean, I know what you're saying about being a medical doctor and having an emergency, but I think some people find it very difficult to differentiate between what's important and what's not really important. But do you think that couples should consciously be setting time aside and saying this is the time when we're going to have the quality time? Or is it should be just a natural way of being on a daily basis?
I think it can be both. I encourage couples to have a brief time every day in which they sit down with each other or take a walk with each other or take a ride together, just for the purpose of being together and talking with each other about how things are going in their lives. Brief time. May just be 15 minutes, but a brief time in which you're emotionally touching each other. And this is extremely important if your spouse's language is his quality time. And then I think there should also be extended times together. It may be taking a weekend off and going to the beach or going to the mountains or doing something both of you enjoy doing, but it's extended quality time. I think we need both of those. And you have to be conscious about that. You have to build that into your schedule. But let's face it, we build everything else into our schedule. You know, we build breakfast, we build lunch, we build the evening meal into our schedules. So why can't we build into our lives a time with each other every day? And if we do that, and if this is their language, they will feel loved.
I love what you said, emotionally touching each other. That's great. Wonderful expression. Okay, so there we have it. Quality time, giving your partner your undivided attention. The third love language is receiving gifts. And this is quite an interesting one, because for me it just seems like the quality time is you really are giving of yourself. The receiving gift seems to be something, well, if I buy something, maybe it's easier, but maybe I've misunderstood it completely.
Well, I think a gift can be bought. It can also be made. It can also be found on the street.
and it has to be, and exactly, and it has to be thought up, doesn't it?
That's exactly right. You see, the gift says to the other person, especially if this is their language, it says to them, he was thinking about me. Look what he got for me. You know, he had to be thinking about her, and this is her language, and I'm going to get her a gift. Even if it is a flower he picks out of the yard, he had to think about her to bring it inside. You know, Niki, my undergraduate degree was in cultural anthropology, and I actually also have a master's degree in cultural anthropology, the study of cultures, world cultures. We have never discovered a culture where gift-giving is not an expression of love. It's universal to give gifts as an expression of love. And so for some people, this is their primary language. And if it's not yours, then you probably have difficulty understanding how could that be meaningful to people. You know, if gifts are not meaningful to you, I don't mean that we don't appreciate gifts. Everyone appreciates a gift, but for some people, this is really what speaks love to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so what do you do? I mean, in that situation, if you look at a couple and the one wants the gifts and the other one isn't, not very generous, and maybe their excuse for not giving the gifts is, well, I just can't afford it. This person is unrealistic about wanting gifts all the time.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things. One, if it's a matter that they can't afford it, then I say to them, we buy the things that are important to us. For example, we buy food, and we often are buying recreational things that we do, either going to sporting events or other things. If you value this marriage, then when you buy her a gift, or it could be the other way, when she buys him a gift, you are investing in your marriage. The money you're spending on that gift is not just spent. That money's invested in building a positive relationship with your spouse. And if I can help them see how important this is, that this is what makes them feel loved, and they can see it as an investment, then they're far more likely to be willing to do that. Another thing I run into, Niki, is that many men will say to me, well, I don't know how to buy gifts for her. I don't know how to buy gifts for her. And he's being honest. He has no experience in doing that. And so I say, okay, if this is her language, then you can learn to buy gifts. Ask her sister for suggestions. Or you might even ask her sister, would you buy her a gift if I give you the money? Chances are she would, and give her a little tip for her effort. But you can learn, you can get insight from. Another way is to listen to what your wife is saying. If you hear her say, as she's watching television and sees something, I'd like to have one of those. I really like that. Go write it down. Make a list of the things you hear her say.
That's a good idea.
And then you have an idea, of what would make her feel loved. So any gift can be meaningful, but one that she really wants is even more meaningful.
Okay, so there we have it. That was love language number 3, receiving gifts. Number 4, acts of service. What do you mean by that?
Acts of service is doing things for your spouse that you know they would like for you to do. For example, cooking a meal is an act of service. Huge act of service. Washing dishes, putting them in the dishwasher, is an act of service. Mowing grass, trimming shrubs, washing the car, doing the laundry, vacuuming the floors, getting white spots off the mirror, cleaning the toilet. Life is filled with opportunities to express acts of service. And if this is your spouse's language, then nothing is more important than you doing things to help them process life. You remember the old saying, Niki, actions speak louder than words. For some people, this is true. It's not true for all people. But if this is their love language, then acts of service, what you do, is more important than what you say. For example, my wife's language is acts of service. My language is words of affirmation. So in the early years of our marriage, I didn't know anything about love languages. So what did I do? I gave my wife, words of affirmation. I told her how nice she looked. I told her, how much I appreciated what she did. I told her 12 times a day, I love you, honey. I love you. I cannot tell you how much I love you. I just love you. But her love language, I didn't know this, her love language was acts of service. I did nothing to help her. I was in graduate school. I saw myself, I'm a student, and I never thought about doing any of those things to help her. And one night she said to me, you keep on saying, I love you, I love you, I love you. If you love me, why don't you help me?
Put your money where your mouth is.
I was blown out of the saddle. What do you mean? If I had known the love language, I would have understood what was happening. I didn't know it, and I didn't understand it, because in my mind, I was loving her. In her mind, if I loved her, I'd be doing something to help her.
You know, I just think about, there's so many, I mean, having kids, Gary, you know, everything changes, because whereas before you don't, as a couple, you can both do your own thing, and if it is washing the dishes, even if the other partner doesn't really help, it's sometimes still acceptable. But I think that once children come on board, and there's such an imbalance in the beginning within the relationship of who's doing, and I would say especially the mother, because she's given birth, and well, she's feeding and she's changing nappies, and men, you know, men today are wonderful and they help. But I've noticed, it's just my observation, is that so often in marriages, as soon as children come along, that's when there is tension that was not there before. So even if people's love language was not necessarily acts of service, it becomes an issue. These mothers want their husbands to help. They want them to also get up at night sometimes, or at least offer, or at least change a nappy, or at least prepare one of the meals. And as I said, this is just a simple observation that I just find this always seems to be something that comes up when children come along.
I think you are exactly right, Niki. Even if acts of service is not her love language, when the children come along, acts of service is going to be very, very important to her. Because, let's face it, raising a child can be overwhelming, and particularly for a mother.
Sure.
It can be overwhelming. And when a husband jumps in and says, you know, I'm going to help you, what can I do to help you tonight? And that becomes a lifestyle for him, he's helping her. She feels his love, even if this is not her love language. Because right now, in her life situation, few things are more important than him helping her with the load that she's carrying.
And selfishness comes to mind as well. You were talking about it's okay to be self-centered because you're going to feed yourself and look after yourself and whatever it is. But selfishness is where there's a problem, and I think that again that's when it can be highlighted. So the partner whose love language is acts of service really has to extend themselves if they have been in a selfish space.
Yes, and I think a part of it also is not only selfishness, but it's our history. You know, if you grew up in a home as a young man and your father mowed the grass and washed the car, but he did not wash dishes, he did not cook meals, he did not vacuum floors, then in your mind, a man mows the grass and washes the car. A woman, you know, does the dishes. Now, that's broken down somewhat in today's culture, those stereotypes. But still, all of us grew up in a family where our father did certain things and our mother did certain things. And we move into marriage with the idea that that's the way it's going to be in our marriage.
Right.
But we grew up in different families, so we have different ideas of what it's going to be like. That's why I encourage couples before they get married to discuss who will do what after we get married. Who's going to buy the groceries? Who's going to cook the meals? Who's going to wash the dishes? Who's going to do everything? Let's talk about this. And if we think we're going to share it, then okay, how is that going to look after we get married? And you're far more likely to go into marriage on the same page than if you just go into marriage and don't discuss these things. So I think it's important for us to talk about who is going to do what once we get married.
Let's look at the final love language, Gary, and that is physical touch.
We've long known that physical touch is an emotional communicator. That's why we pick up babies, we hold them, we kiss them, we cuddle them, and long before the baby understands the meaning of the word love, the baby feels love by physical touch. So physical touch, again, is a universal language of love. There are no cultures where people don't touch each other. And in a marriage relationship, I'm talking about such things as holding hands, kissing, embracing, the whole sexual part of the marriage, arm around the shoulder, driving down the road, you put your hand on their leg, just meaningful, affirming touches. And for some people, this is their primary love language. And if you don't ever touch them, it communicates to them, you don't love me. If you love me, you'd be reaching out and touching me. And you see, for the person for whom this is not their love language, let's say they're not a touchy kind of person, this becomes a very difficult language to learn. I remember the man who said to me, the father, he said, Gary, I have a son who's 10 years old, and I read your book on love languages, and I really believe my son's language is physical touch, because when my wife touches and hugs him, he just really eats it up. He said, but I did not grow up in a touchy family. I don't ever remember my father hugging me. And he said, I can't imagine walking up to my son and hugging him. And I said, okay, well, let's just start with something little. How about walking up tonight and just put out your index finger and just touch him on the shoulder? That's all, just touch him. That's it. And let's do that 3 times this week. And then next week, we're going to give him a little pat on the back. And I just kind of walked him through learning how to touch his son.
Sure.
And eventually, of course, he became comfortable with that. So we have to acknowledge that we don't by nature speak all of these languages, but we can learn to speak these languages. And if we want the significant people in our lives to feel loved, we have to learn to speak love in a language they will understand.
I'm just thinking about the whole physical touch. I'm thinking about women, men, the different expectations in terms of physical touch, and some women, perhaps, or men, let me not be specific, sometimes a physical touch, just wanting it to be a touch and not necessarily the start of something that could be sexual. Do you find that's often a stumbling block for people?
Yes, it is. I think a lot of men will hear these 5 love languages and automatically say, oh, my language is physical touch. But they're thinking sex. And I say to them, well, maybe physical touch is your language, but let me ask you a question. Do non-sexual touches make you feel loved? And often they look shocked. Are there non-sexual touches? And I say, for example, when you get out of the car, the 2 of you, and you're walking into a store, if she reaches over and holds your hand, does that make you feel loved? And if he says, well, not really, it's okay, but not really. I said, now if she's pouring a cup of coffee for you and she puts her other hand on your shoulder, does that make you feel loved? And if he says, well, no, not really. I said, then physical touch is not your love language. I mean, yes, you have a natural drive for sexual relationships, but that's not really what makes you feel loved. Physical touch, it's one of the other languages. And often they'll come back after they do a little study of reflection or take the quiz in the book. They'll come back and say, my love language is words of affirmation. I just realized that. Or it's something else, I love sex. I mean, I want to have sex with my wife, but, yeah, you're right. My real language is this. So I think there sometimes can be misunderstanding there about what physical touch is. It's not just the sexual relationship. It can be other kinds of touches.
Gary, listening to you and looking at the 5 love languages, so words of affirmation, quality time, receiving gifts, acts of service, physical touch, they all resonate with me. And while I know there's probably one that really stands out for me, I'm sure people listening are saying, oh, but I'm that, oh no, but maybe I'm that, or actually I think my love language is that. What do you say? And then when people actually fill it in at the back of your book, because there's something that wives fill in, and then there's something that husbands fill in, and if people aren't married, it can just be whichever you are in the relationship. Does it come up very clear that you just have the one? I mean, we spoke about the primary love language, but what about all those gray areas when you think, oh no, but that is important, and gosh, that's very important?
Yeah, I think typically people will have a primary love language. However, having said that, I do have people say to me, I think all 5 of those are just equal for me. And typically when a person says that, there's one of 2 things. Either they have felt loved all their lifetime. They felt loved by their parents. They feel loved by their spouse. Probably because their parents spoke almost all of these languages to them to some degree, and their spouse speaks almost all of these. So they really don't know which one stands out. They just know, I feel loved. And I say to those people, great, don't worry about it. As long as you feel loved, that's okay, But the other people are those who grew up in homes where they never felt loved by their parents. They didn't receive any of these languages, or very few of these languages, and they didn't feel loved. and they really don't quite know what it means to feel loved. So they don't know which one of these would make them feel loved because they've never felt loved.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a more difficult situation because, you know, there's an emotional struggle there.
Mm-hmm.
But even those people, I think, can learn to receive love and express love in these languages. And almost anything will be meaningful to them because they grew up with such a deficit of love. But I think for most people, one of these will typically stand out. Two of them may be very close. So I say sometimes you can have a primary love language and a secondary love language, and the secondary can be very close to the first. But, you know, the message is give heavy doses of the primary love language, then sprinkle in the other 4 for extra credit. So, yeah, all of these can be meaningful, but you need to give heavy doses of the primary love language.
I think that any couple starting a relationship, a marriage, to be able to fill in the form and to be able to identify a love language and work on these areas from word go is the greatest bonus. I would say it's a gift. It's a wonderful gift that they can give to their marriage. People who have been in relationships for a long period of time where, as you've said, there's just this huge disconnect. They could be sitting in the same room, but there's just no connection between them. So I'm thinking a little bit of anger. When there's so much disappointment and there's so much frustration that it's turned into this boiling, simmering anger that just seems to be there all the time. What do you say to couples, Gary, when they can't even get to the love languages? They can't even try and understand the other love language because they're just at that boiling point?
Well, I think we have to learn to get rid of anger because anger held inside turns to bitterness and hatred. And hatred is that attitude or that emotion which pushes you to want to make them suffer for what they've done to you. And that will destroy you and may well destroy them. So we've got to learn to process anger. The emotion of anger is healthy in its early stages because it reminds us that something's wrong in the relationship. I feel like I've been hurt. We have to learn to say to a spouse, I'm feeling angry because in my mind what you did was very hurtful and very painful. But now if you've built up this wall, you have all this hatred in there, I think we have to come to grips with that and recognize if I continue down this road, it is self-destructive and it's also destroying my marriage. I'm going to deal with this. I'm going to say to my spouse, I know that I've hurt you in many ways. I'm thinking back of the time I yelled at you, I screamed at you, and just list some of the things I've done in the past to them. And I really want to see my life changed, and I am apologizing to you for the way I have handled my anger in the past. I know I've hurt you deeply, and you just go on and explain it to them. And then say, I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. And maybe they will forgive you. Maybe they'll say, I'll have to think about that. But you have made a powerful step when you acknowledge that you have mismanaged your anger through the years. And once you've done that, it's like you tore the wall down on your side of the wall. And then in due time, if you then start speaking the love language of your spouse, there's a good chance that they're going to come back to you and say, I also owe you an apology, and they'll begin to apologize for their past failures. Now you are on the road to really making your marriage what you want it to be by speaking each other's love language.
Gary, it has been such a valuable hour. I have learned so much, and I'm sure that my listeners have too. So, thank you for your generosity and for sharing this time with us. We so appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Niki. It was good to be with you, and you keep up the good work of helping people, all right?
Oh, thank you, Gary. It's been wonderful. You take care. That was Gary Chapman. Thank you. Best-selling author of The 5 Love Languages. It is such a good book. It is an easy read. It will resonate with you. And it's just if you want to be able to understand the love languages of the person that you love as well as your own. I hope you have found it beneficial. As I said, I have learned so much. What an incredible man, and what a wonderful, warm person he is, Gary Chapman. So that brings the show to an end. Remember to tune in, same time next week. Also, if you've missed some of the conversation, go to the website www.conversationswithniki.co.za and you can get the podcast there. Until next week, take care of yourself. From me, Niki Seberini. Goodbye. Conversations with Niki was brought to you by studyapps.co.za, South Africa's leading education app for tablets.